Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Please be seated. Today's epistle, St. Paul says, "Now abide in faith, hope, charity. These three, but the greatest of these is charity." And then Paul tells us that without charity, we're nothing. In a similar vein, St. Robert Bellamy once said that charity is that which no man is lost, and without which no man is saved. And then again, St. John of the Cross said that at the end of our life, we shall be judged by our charity. Charity, we hear that name or that word used so often. And I think to our modern ears, we tend to think of it only in the sense of giving perhaps of our money to sponsor a cause that is dear to our hearts. And yet, when we take a look to find out what the church teaches and preaches and calls the word charity, we get this: that charity is the theological virtue by which we love God above all things for His own sake. And then we love our neighbors as ourselves for the love of God. Of course, then, God being the source of all things, then, of course, is the source of charity as well. It's He, then, who first loved us. As we're told, it's He that first poured His love into us in the hopes that it would come back to Him. And then God says to us, and He asks of us, and He pleads with us, that we will give ourselves to Him wholly. God has said that, "For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice. I desire the knowledge of God rather than that of burnt offerings." And He said this through the prophet Hosea. What God means is that above all of these things that we say that we do in His name, what He really wants is that our hearts would be fully behind whatever gesture we make to Him. And whatever gesture we make towards our brothers and sisters. God then desires an offering of our hearts, our minds, and our souls over against all other things that we might do in the name of our religion. When God then asks for us to give of our hearts and of our minds and our souls, I think in our Eucharist here, we have the perfect response, a very beautiful response. When we say to God, "And here we offer present unto Thee, O Lord, ourselves, our souls, and bodies, to be a reasonable, holy, living sacrifice unto Thee. Humbly beseech Thee that we and all others who shall be partakers of this holy communion may worthily receive the most precious body and blood of Thy Son, Jesus Christ. Be filled with Thy grace and heavenly benediction, made one body with Him, that He may dwell in us, and we in Him." God wants from us, above all else, is us to be family, to be community, to live in union with Him and with one another in this bond of love that flows from the Trinity into us and then back to the Trinity. So in these words then that we say in a Eucharistic prayer, what we're doing is we're making a sacrifice of love, that is a pledge of love, a promise to God that we will give Him our whole being, our hearts, minds, bodies, souls. And what we're really saying that is Christ gave Himself up for us on the cross, and so we'll give ourselves up for Him in service to Him by pledging our love, all of it, back to Him. So in response to our promise, Jesus then says to us, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And then, of course, he gives the command over and over in a number of places throughout the Gospels that as I have loved you, so must you love one another. Well, that begs the question then, how does Jesus love us? And again, if we go back to the Gospels, the Scriptures only contain just a small portion of all of the different ways that he loved his brothers and sisters when he was here on this earth. But in countless ways, he's loved us. In today's Gospel, St. Luke gives us just one small example of that. Luke then recounts that as Jesus and his apostles were going up to Jerusalem to fulfill his destiny, that there was a number that had gone ahead of him. And along the way then there was this blind beggar who, when he discovered that Jesus was coming by, and cried out to him, Lord, have mercy upon me. Those who went ahead then, Luke tells us, chastised the man rather than perhaps mirroring Jesus' love and compassion. And of course, Luke, the story progresses, tells us then Jesus, hearing the man's pleas, comes to him and asks what he desires. And says, to have my sight. And then out of compassion, in contrast to those who were uncharitable in their response and told him to be quiet, Jesus heals him. He restores him. He gives him his sight. Tells him that his faith had saved him. Now this act of charity of Jesus, it all fits the pattern of everything that Jesus had ever done in one way or another, whether it was through his words or his deeds, through his healings. They all pointed back towards the greater act of charity that God showed towards us. That greater act of charity that he went up to Jerusalem to fulfill on the cross. And it shows that even though he was focused on going up to fulfill his destiny, he still had time for his brothers and sisters. He still made time to minister, to give of himself to another. So in doing that, Jesus not only points towards this supreme act of divine charity that he's getting ready to do for us, he's also giving us a powerful reminder that a lasting and genuine love of neighbor is our fundamental duty as his disciples. The fundamental duty of all who then profess to love God and proclaim him as their Savior. So when we reflect on deeds of Jesus, not just today's gospel, but in all of his words and all of his deeds, all of his miracles, what Jesus shows us is that love is not a passive thing. It's not just that we say, I love you, and that's it, but that we back up those words and those thoughts we have with our actions. And what Jesus is asking us to do is not just to act, but through those actions is to bear fruit in the kingdom of God. We heard about that last week. And what that means then is that as Christians, we cannot simply just sit by passively and then let evil speak its lies and then wickedness carry our brothers and sisters away into the darkness. What that means then is We're called then to be beacons of God's love, of Christ's love. Beacons of his light. And so then, like what Christ did for the blind man today, giving him his sight, our job then is to help others see the truth of God's love for them. Remember what Jesus said? He said, "Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your God in heaven." I often wonder, if all of us were to do this, perhaps make it a more conscious act, myself included, what the Christian churches would look like today. I would bet that we'd have full pews, and we'd have a country that wasn't crumbling apart, but a country that is strong because it's grounded in God and the love that flows from him. I think we hear so much in the news and all of the negativity that I think it's a temptation for all of us just to throw up our hands and just say, "There's nothing I can do, forget it." And I think even when we think in a smaller setting about our own church, we think, "Forget it, there's nothing I can do, we're just going to ride it out." That's the attitude we have in this country as well. We're just going to ride it out. But faithfulness is what we're called to, even when things look bad. So even though our numbers might be small, God is still telling us that we have to be his mouthpiece in this world. And if the world is loud, then we have to speak more loudly. That we have to step out of our timidity. That we have to stop being so passive. That we have then to take the gospel, not just through here, not to one another, but out through those doors where there's countless numbers of our brothers and sisters who are on a quick ride to hell. And he then calls us then not only to be his mouth, but to be his hands. That is, to go out and do the works he's called us to do in this world. To go out and be that loving presence. Perhaps be those arms of God's love that wraps around another person, hug them, just to reassure them that God is with them, and then in the end all will be well. Paul tells us that charity or love is the greatest of all virtues, and it's simply because all other virtues flow from it. That is, if we do whatever we do, and we don't have our hearts in it, we don't really give of ourselves, then it's an empty gesture. I think we have countless examples of, you hear about all these people that give all this money to these charities or what have you, and yet most of them it's just a small pittance out of their accounts, and it's really works to their financial benefit. And so while we are all in awe about how they're so generous, the truth of the matter is they're just getting a benefit out of it. I'm not saying that's true of everybody. There are those that truly give with the heart. But if whatever we do, even if it's like the widow who offers her very last penny, if we do it with our heart, it makes all the difference in the world. So what Paul is telling us is that without charity, that our faith is empty. That without charity, our religion is empty. And that's why he warns us then in today's epistle. Remember what he said? That if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have the gift of prophecy and cannot fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains, and yet I do not love, I'm nothing. If I give all that I possess to the poor, give over my body to hardship, that I may boast, but I do not love, I gain nothing. So of course then that brings us to the season of Lent that we're getting ready to enter into. think in a real way today's lessons are designed to remind us that our Lenten obligations, our Lenten exercises, they're not meant to be just a burden we get through, not just something we do because the church tells us that we have to do it, but it's something that we do for love of God and for love of one another. And it's something then that is meant to grow us in that love for God and for one another. So thus then, in all of the fastings that we do, whatever almsgivings that we may give this season, and whatever other spiritual exercises we may engage in, and then of course even our everyday activities, not just our activities here in church, but outside of these doors. If they're to have any real meaning, if they're to bear fruit, not just in my life or in your life, but in the lives of those we encounter, the charity or love put into action, sacrifice, the giving of our hearts, must be the beginning and end point of all that we do. I ran across this touching little story, and you may have heard it before, but I'd like to share it with you again. In his book called Dad, the Family Coach, Dave Simmons tells of an act of sacrificial love that occurred in a shopping mall. One day, he took his 8-year-old daughter, Helen, and 5-year-old son, Brandon, to the mall. He needed to buy some tools at Sears. And when he pulled into this parking lot into the mall parking lot, there was a big sign that said petting zoo. Immediately the kids jumped up and asked, "Can we go, Daddy? Can we go, please?" And seeing that it would be no trouble at all, and concluding that it might even make his trip quicker, Dave said sure and handed both of his kids a quarter. They bolted away as he headed for Sears. A few minutes later, he was making his way down the aisle when he spotted Helen slowly walking up behind him. She looked up at him and said, "Well, Daddy, it cost 50 cents, so I gave Brandon my quarter." Then she said the most beautiful thing of all. She repeated their family motto, "Love is action." What do you think he did? Not what you might think. Dave simply finished his shopping and then took Helen back to the petting zoo. They stood by the fence, watching Brandon go crazy petting and feeding all the animals. Helen stood with her hands in her pockets, looking across the fence and watching her brother. And Dave felt 50 more cents in his pocket, almost burning a hole in them. But he never offered it up to her, and she never asked for it. For Helen was following through then on a simple lesson that the family lived by. That love is not just action, but love is sacrificial action. That love always pays a price. That love costs something. Love is expensive. That when you love, benefits accrue to the accounts of another. That love gives and doesn't grab. I know that in this world that we live in, and we're all so busy, that it's so hard for us to sometimes want to give just a little bit more of ourselves. But that's what God's asking for us in this season of Lent. Not just to add one more activity that we have a hard time keeping up with, but He's asking that through these activities we engage in, that we come to give Him our heart, and we come to give one another our hearts. Learn how to sacrificially love one another, and in doing so, that we love Him. So in the end, the whole point of today's lessons is that our faith, that whatever we do for God and for one another, again, if it's to be genuine, it involves love. That is, to give completely of ourselves, to make sacrifices. And if we think about it, it's the only way that any of us are ever going to truly bear fruit not just in our own lives and our children's lives, not only here within this church, but out in the broader community. And in closing, I'd like to just leave you with this short little quote from Mother Teresa. She says, "A sacrifice to be real," and this goes back to our story, "must cost, it must hurt, it must empty ourselves." And she goes on to say that in the emptiness of ourselves, we encounter silence. And the fruit of that silence then is prayer. And then the fruit of prayer then is faith. And the fruit of faith then is love. And the fruit of love is service. And then the fruit of service is peace in our hearts, our minds, and souls. Amen. Remember the words of our Lord Jesus.